Hello and welcome to the Lafayette Club's online lecture series. While the coronavirus pandemic wreaked much havoc on the world, China's aggressive maneuvers against India, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and its escalating tensions with the US have sent alarm bells ringing worldwide. While the dragon is baring its fangs, what is at stake for the world and especially the West? Are we witnessing an aggressive, expansionist China, or are these claims exaggerated as China claims it to be? And will the rise of China alter the global geopolitical landscape and the general balance of power? To answer these pertinent questions, we are joined by Mr. Chris Ogden, Senior Lecturer in Asian Security at the University of St. Andrews. He's a researcher and author. His recent book, China, India, and Asia's Emergent Great Powers, focuses on great power politics and China and India's rise to worldwide importance. He specializes in great power politics, foreign policy, and nationalism. In 2008, Mr. Ogden founded the European Scholars of South Asian International Relations Research Network. He has previously taught at the Universities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Durham, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I am Satyajit Mohanan, co-director of the club. And thank you, Mr. Ogden, for joining us today.
Morning.
All right, to move on to the first question. The rise of China as a great power has been talked about in detail over the years. It's not something which took place recently and had been taking place over the years, say a decade or so. However, its aggressive behavior and its increasingly visible expansionist design this year has brought the Asian superpower back in focus. From its suppression of democracy in Hong Kong to its bloody border dispute with India, what has changed with China this year? Has it? I mean, it's always been talked that China is rising and is a potential superpower and a threat to the West. But what has particularly changed with China this year?
I think we can consider a couple of factors. I think the pandemic is a very big factor. I think the pandemic is causing chaos around the world. It's keeping governments very busy. It's keeping them very preoccupied. And I think from a personal viewpoint, it provides a kind of sense of opportunity. It's an extended crisis, there's an extended window for states, China amongst them, to try and pursue particular goals kind of in the morass of the pandemic. So I think you're certainly seeing that in the Indian context. I think you can arguably see that in the Hong Kong context. On top of that too, we mustn't forget that China's had its own experience of the pandemic. Some of that's been quite negative. Certainly the CCP, certainly Xi Jinping want public support. And nationalism and fonts of nationalism, or the aims of nationalism, have always been used by the CCP as a way to deflect internal criticism. So if the party is being criticised internally, why not focus upon regaining territory, i.e. with Hong Kong? Why not focus upon a regional rival, India, so on and so forth? So I think there's a couple of factors at play there. On top of that too, I think a lot can also be said maybe about Xi Jinping himself. So in recent years, he's been able to change the constitution to give him unlimited rule in terms of unlimited time. And maybe that's also been a factor that's played into this, that maybe there are fewer dissenting voices that have kind of held him back. And he's been more assertive, more aggressive, and maybe that's a reflection of his character, as it were. And that's something that's definitely changed in the last, I'd say, 5 years in terms of being more assertive, more confident.
Right. But, China has termed such expansionist claims as exaggerated and baseless. The Chinese always maintain that the border disputes with its neighbors was legitimate, and its initiatives such as the BRI and the presence in Africa should only be seen in pure economic terms. And, do you think that this expansionist claim is a part of America's propaganda and has been slightly exaggerated?
So I think the debate about expansionism and if these actions are expansionist is very much in the eye of the beholder. It's very much in terms of who's saying it and why they're deciding to say it. So from the Chinese perspective, and I would agree with the Chinese perspective, it's not expansionist. Hong Kong used to be part of Chinese territory before the Opium Wars. It was taken by an external party. It's slowly being reabsorbed back into China. Now, you can argue definitely that the Chinese government is being more aggressive. They're threatening rights within Hong Kong. They're accelerating that process. But there's only a 50-year window up until 2047 when Hong Kong is meant to be completely reabsorbed. So from the Chinese perspective, and I would argue from the perspective of the Chinese population, it's quite normal to want to do this. They want to regain their territory. With the border issues with India, pretty much the same thing. The issue there is that no one really knows where the borders are. They're very badly demarcated. There's always been lots of opposing claims. I think the more telling thing is who's saying it's expansionist and why do we think it's expansionist? And I think this points to maybe deep-seated concerns in the West about China's rise really fulfilling itself, China definitely becoming a great power, being feared as a superpower, being feared as an alternate basis of power or influence or norms and values within the international system. And I think it's symptomatic of that. So that's why we're really seeing these narratives coming from the West, United States in particular, but also the UK of China's expansionist, China wants to take over the world, China is aggressive, so on and so forth. I think our difficulty in international relations is just to fully understand exactly where we lie between those two parameters. So again, Chinese viewpoint seems quite legitimate. In a sense, you could also say the Western viewpoint also seems quite legitimate because it's about the West losing status within the international system. I think the main difference for me would be is just the rate, that kind of acceleration, the level of assertiveness, the level of confidence, the ability that's been kind of inculcated within Chinese elites, where they've realized that they have so much economic power and structural power that really essentially who can do anything about it. And I think that Xi Jinping has realized that China's kind of over that crest. So why not be more assertive? You know, what are you going to do? And I think the example with China and India is quite symptomatic of that as well. India came back with quite forceful words, but what did it really do? It put some sanctions in place, but it didn't respond militarily, for example. And I think that's indicative of the balance of power in the current system.
Right. That's exactly my third question. You know, how do you view the recent Indo-China border clash, which resulted in the killing of 20 Indian soldiers? I mean, do you think that India would shed its non-alignment policy and would join the hands with the US in order to contain China, or do you think the status quo will be maintained?
So, in a very broad sense, I do not think that India will ever have a firm alliance with the United States in the traditional sense of alliance, where they have papers that are signed to say, when you're invaded, we'll support you, so on and so forth. I think India has always been very good at being in between powers, using powers, but never declaring itself one way or the other. So you can see that with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. After the nuclear test in 1998, you can see it with America. To some degree, you can also see it with China, kind of economically. I think it depends which kind of zone you want to discuss. In terms of territory, in terms of Kashmir, the Indian position has always been very sensitive to any outside interference or kind of insights or help. This stems from Indian claims being rebuffed in the UN in the 1940s. In general, norms of non-interference and not being told what to do. So I don't really think that they would ally themselves with the United States in order to try and resolve that issue. I think they'll always try to do it internally. And there are further dynamics. The US still has some links with Pakistan, still has strategic interest in Afghanistan. So it's not so simple as to say that they could just get the help from America and that would help resolve the issue. Also, the issue itself it's extremely complex. Jammu and Kashmir has been split into two states now. Pakistan itself changed the status of its own part of Kashmir to help with its trade routes stemming from China. So I think it's got very complicated.
Right. A secondary question to that. Do you think this recent economic boycott by the Indian government towards the Chinese, do you think that would be successful in the long term? Do you think India can sustain itself without the Chinese?
I definitely think India can sustain itself without the Chinese. Again, they probably can't raise at the same kind of rate. China would provide cheap money, kind of no holds barred money in the sense of there not being that many conditions. But India can find other investment partners, in particular Japan, in particular Western countries. I think India's been ripe for a very long time for lots of external investment to come in. So I think that's completely feasible. I think also that boycott, the kind of tariff wars that are broadly oscillating with the international system, I think India's steps are indicative of that as well. I think EU states, America, the UK to a degree, and others are all starting to realise that maybe China's influence is a bit too strong. So they're all taking action. But I don't really see that India's rise is dependent upon China in a sense of, say, economic activity.
All right. To move on to the fourth question, do you think the world would likely witness a Cold War 2.0? And if so, do you see a united front against the Chinese? For instance, in Asia alone, the Chinese have opened up fronts against Australia, Japan, India, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bhutan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Do you think there would be a grand alliance against the Chinese in the coming days, if at all there is a Cold War 2.0?
So this is a very interesting question, right? So this has become quite a popular narrative in the West. We're going to see a new Cold War. It's going to be just how it was between the Soviet Union and the United States. Personally, for me, I don't think it's a very useful term at all. I think we're talking about two very different entities. So during the Cold War, the major players in that bipolar schism, in that competition, were very far apart from each other economically. We could generally talk about different blocks at that stage that were quite separate. In the current system, first of all, globalization means we're all highly intertwined, but also the US and China are themselves massively intertwined with each other. So the trade war, the tariffs, for example, they hit both sides. Now you can say some tariffs will affect China more. You can say other tariffs will affect the United States more. But the bottom line is they're both being affected. So effectively, they hit the other side, but they hit themselves at the same time. This is very different than what was happening during the Cold War. So in that sense, they're so intertwined, they have such a degree of symbiosis that essentially, if the Chinese economy fails, the American economy will fail. But equally, on top of that, if the Chinese economy fails, because it has such centrality in terms of production, but also pulling in and using raw materials and commodities, the global economy will fail. So a Chinese recession means a global recession. A Chinese defeat or a Chinese, splitting up in the same way that we saw with the Soviet Union will have massive ramifications for the international system. I don't think there would be a post-Cold War II dividend, like a peace dividend. I think it would be absolute chaos. So I think in that sense, the term of reference doesn't really kind of fit. And my feeling in terms of what the world can do about China is, again, I feel as though we've gone too far a little bit. That we've, in a way, from the Western perspective, is we've taken advantage of China to a particular degree. Cheap manufacturing goods there, bringing them back to the West. Western companies enjoy those huge profits. But really, we've hollowed out our own industries, hollowed out lots of things, and have it all produced in China or have it all produced in East Asia. So we're highly dependent upon China for our economic model. But equally, China's amassed so much economic power that it's exceptionally difficult to truly question China or to do anything about China, particularly in the current context. So as much as some leaders have come out to say, we don't like what's happening in Hong Kong, these states don't come out and say, we're going to boycott China. And the UK is the best example of this. The UK, notwithstanding the pandemic, but also what's going to happen very soon with Brexit, if it's a hard Brexit, we'll need international partners, and they will come to a strategic calculation where they say, we need Chinese trade. It doesn't kind of matter what our values are or the political ramifications, we need them. And again, this is my point about the overall general balance of power switched in the system to such a degree that I think it's very hard for everyone to gang up on China. Everybody will lose. Now, that might sound quite defeatist, but I don't fully understand what the solution is. I think the solution, in a way, would be more realistic about it, understand maybe some positive things that are coming from China, and understand that maybe acting together and working together would be much better than creating this kind of artificial schism. My final point, though, is that the narrative with the Second Cold War is very easy for everybody to understand. It's very easy for policymakers to understand. It's very easy for the public to understand. It's the red threat. We just replaced the Soviet Union with China. Everybody can understand that. Yeah. So I think there is a possibility that it could easily become the dominant narrative, even though it won't be the most useful narrative for us to have.
Absolutely. I think this gets closer to the fifth question. I mean, how do you view the EU's policy towards China? Do you think they're very hesitant in being sucked into a power struggle between America and China?
Again, they're stuck in a difficult place, aren't they? Yeah. And particularly when you have a very belligerent American president who's really kind of all or nothing, everything's on the table. You'll do this or you'll do that. But then you'll find out 5 days later that actually maybe he means the opposite. It's very difficult to understand where you kind of sit. And again, I think the dynamic, certainly in contemporary international relations, is that most of the power is pushing towards the East, is pushing towards Asia. And whilst it does that, whilst there's a relative growth in that area, there's a relative decline in the West. So that means that America feels under pressure, the EU also feels under pressure, and it's stuck between kind of both areas. I think the other difficulties with the EU is that it's very interesting, say Chinese strategists and Indian strategists, when they talk about the great powers, they will include the EU. But they see them as one kind of collective bloc. And then normally they'll add the United States, Russia, maybe Japan. That's kind of roughly where they think the central poles are. But with the EU, their major focus is really trade and possibly kind of values, but that's the limit of their foreign policy at the moment. So in many ways, they're hamstrung by their own existence. Like they can't threaten a military, I don't know, force or military invasion. They can act in a unified way in a diplomatic sense. But again, they're stuck between the two. My final point would really be about the kind of political system as well. That's the greatest difference. And in terms of, say, values and human rights, EU wants to be democratic, really predominantly is democratic, has a certain view of kind of universal, individualistic human rights. This is very different to what China has, much more authoritarian, much more collective in terms of its human rights. And we have a United States, which somehow seems to be a bit in between at the moment. We have a president who seems to be more highly authoritarian day by day, who in some circumstances is reducing rights. So I think eventually what will happen is that the EU will just have to admit that it's on its own.
Right.
And then use those major fulcrums and decide where it wants to be. But again, the EU has its own economic problems. There are things that we've kind of forgotten about with Brexit and the pandemic, but there used to be lots of reports about French banks not having enough liquidity, Italian banks not having enough liquidity, that their economies could collapse. And they also need Chinese money. They need Chinese investment, which to a degree is free, as long as you don't criticize China. So I think the EU will also be confronted by that dynamic quite soon. Right. And again, in the context of a pandemic, maybe the choice is you've got to go for the money. There's nothing else you can do unless you want to.
Right. Again, to add to that, do you think, if at all, hypothetically, there's a change in the regime in the US and Mr. Biden comes to power? Do you think the policy of the US would drastically change, or do you think they would really maintain the same pace?
Yeah, this is also a very good question. So I think fundamentally, and from an international relations perspective, and are there any students of international relations watching this? I think the US mindset in terms of foreign policy is exceptionally realist, i.e., there has to be a hegemon, i.e. the world is in anarchy, i.e. everybody is your competitor. And I think deep down, that is the American perspective in international relations. And I think regardless of who the American leader is, there is a realization that has come now, but was really coming for the last decades, that China would be the #1 strategic competitor and that China threatens that position. And I don't think that that's going to change between it being Trump or being Biden. However, I do think that Biden would be a lot more balanced. Again, try to craft some kind of future that is much more stable, is much more sure-footed, and works together. And maybe understands that international relations isn't kind of all or nothing. You know, you can have great trading relations with a country, but you can disagree with them politically. That's okay.
Absolutely.
And that can kind of be win-win. And I think the other big difference with Biden came, you just have a lot more certainty. We would know that whatever he said, he would actually do.
Right.
And I think in some senses, how China's responding at the moment is a response to Trump's it's so scattershot. It's so, you just don't know where you're standing. You don't know what's happening.
Twitter rants. Yeah. To move on, you have extensively covered China. Therefore, looking towards the future, in your opinion, how do you think a Chinese-led world order would look like?
So, first of all, I don't know whether they would lead the world order. So, the mindset in the United States, highly realist, but really, and highly based upon hegemony. But the mindset, certainly strategically from the Chinese side, is much more about multipolarity, not wanting hegemony, not wanting to be the leader, being amongst a group of great powers, but not being the foremost kind of power. Personally, I think that system will be highly authoritarian. A lot of this is to do with China in the way that it's treating its population, but also in ways that we're seeing it kind of exporting that political ideology. But again, if we look at the other great powers, maybe with the exception of the EU, they're all quite authoritarian in their own way. Russia's definitively authoritarian. India's becoming more and more authoritarian, more populist. United States, if we keep on having President Trump, undoubtedly will become much more authoritarian. And in that sense, the broad contours of the international system will reflect that, I think. So much more less about kind of democracy, less about promotion of democracy. I would say much more internal looking. At the same time, though, the other major tenet for us to think about in terms of how China views the world order is that it's very much based upon harmony and working together, but providing that everybody respects and understands China's position. Yeah. So if China's status is recognized as being a great power, then China can actually be quite magnanimous to other states. It will work with other states. So I think quite feasibly that could kind of be the future that we look at, maybe quite authoritarian capitalist, successful trade, successful investment, kind of win-win on that level, but also maybe that states are left a bit more to themselves. I certainly don't really ever see China being massively interventionist. I don't see them having military bases around the world in order to conduct wars against any opponent wherever. I think they'll just use trade and development, kind of building up the third world, building up kind of South-South credibility, building up Asia as a way of gaining power rather than brute force. So probably politically less rosy, less positive for us in the West, right, as we also become authoritarian, but more about development, more about economic growth. And my final point there would be, is again, we should remember with China, that the major aims of its foreign policy are always internal. They're always about domestic development, always about modernization. It has huge challenges internally, lots of internal unrest, lots of associated problems. It has the longest borders in the world of any country, the most amount of neighbors of any country in the world. So I think that will also constrain its outlook. So I think it will be there as a voice, but it won't be a leader. And the result might be a more chaotic system in a way, because there won't be a global policeman. But critics would say the United States, maybe it'll be more stable actually, because you won't get intervention all the time.
Yeah. In conclusion, Mr. Ogden, and briefly, what do you think would happen in Hong Kong? Do you think China has completely taken over Hong Kong and the West has lost complete control over it, or do you think there will be a solution at the end?
I think the overall trajectory is that it will be absorbed within China by 2047, as agreed by China and the UK when they handed back Hong Kong in 1997. I think the rate at which they're doing it might change. I think hopefully they've learned to be a bit more savvy, like they understand that it's detrimental to their kind of international image. But I think at the same time, kind of going full circle to where we began, I think the coronavirus provides a very good opportunity for them, particularly in terms of, say, track and trace capabilities. You make sure everybody in Hong Kong has that app. You can trace them wherever they are, whatever they're doing. You can trace all their contacts, so on and so forth. And I think that this can be very useful in terms of kind of subduing the population. In terms of what Western actors can do, I'm not very sure. I mean, if you look at, say, what the UK has done, they said, we'll let anyone leaving Hong Kong come to the UK. Well, in a sense, if I was in charge of China, I'd be like, that's great. Let all the dissidents leave. Let any opposition figures leave. And that'll kind of make our job easier. But I do think the trajectory is there. And I do think because of the pandemic, and I would say because of the US president, there's a lack of leadership in order to really actually solidly do anything about this. And I think the CCPs realise this and they're acting within that kind of strategic opening, as it were. So I don't feel very positive, I would say.
Thank you very much, sir. This brings us to the end of the program. Thank you for accepting our invite. It was an honor to have you with us today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.